You know, so much has already been said about this whole controversy over the taking down of Confederate monuments in places like New Orleans that I probably don't need to repeat most of it. I'm sure you all have already heard it. And those of you who haven't, I'd invite you to consult some of the sources that I shared in the description underneath this video to get a sense of what people in the know, people who are actually educated and informed about the causes of the Civil War, have to say about the South's motives for seceding from the Union in particular. All right? Please, promise me you'll check out those sources. Promise me you'll take a look at what Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, for example, had to say about the causes of the South's secession, namely slavery and the desire to perpetuate it, in his infamous cornerstone speech from 1861. Promise me that you'll take a look at the link that I provided below to the secession ordinances, the declarations that various Southern state legislatures passed when they were bugging out of the Union to make it crystal clear to the whole world exactly why they were doing it. Namely, that's right, the big S word, slavery. Take a look, please. But after you take a look, or maybe before, if that's what suits you, hear me out. The most annoying thing about this whole debate is this argument you keep hearing from opponents of removing these monuments or opponents of taking down, say, the Confederate flag from, say, the South Carolina state capitol like they did a couple years ago after the Charleston Church massacre. The most annoying thing is this argument you hear that such moves erase history. Nothing could be further from the truth. Lord have mercy, people. Will you think? Exactly how does removing a monument like, say, the statues of Robert E. Lee or P.G.T. Beauregard, those two famous Confederate Civil War generals in New Orleans, how does taking down those monuments erase history? Do you really think that people are somehow not going to be aware of who these historical figures are just because these statues are taken down? Really? Think about it. What are the main ways most people learn about the Civil War? If they learn anything about it at all. God knows there's so much misinformation floating around out there about that conflict and its causes. Where do they mainly learn about it? Is it not in school? In history classes? Those who pay attention, of course. I mean, how are those sources of knowledge about the Civil War and figures like Robert E. Lee or P.G.T. Beauregard somehow going to disappear or cease to be effective simply because these statues and monuments are taken down? It doesn't make any sense. Nothing about taking down these monuments means that people are no longer going to be able to learn about these figures, about the history behind that noxious flag, or about the Civil War and the Confederacy in general. People are still going to have access to school textbooks and school courses and museums and any number of other means of learning about the Civil War, including learning about generals like Robert E. Lee. Where do people get this idea that taking down these monuments, removing these statues, is somehow going to erase history? What earthly sense does that make? Come on, people. Use your heads. Use the old noggin. Statues, like these statues of generals like Lee and Beauregard, they're far from the only or even the primary sources of knowledge and information about the Civil War. So it doesn't make a lick of sense to say that removing these statues is going to erase history. It's just another in a long, sorry line of lame arguments in defense not only of these monuments, but of the Confederacy itself. That's all it is. And it's just as weak as all those other arguments. I'm not going to go into all the details now, but the bottom line is the Confederate States of America was a mercifully and thankfully short-lived country that was founded on the explicit premise that slavery needed to be protected. That was stated in, again, those secession ordinances that countless Southern state legislatures passed. It was stated at the time by major Confederate leaders like Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis. Hell, even a generation or more after the war, there were some Confederate veterans of the war, like John Mosby, who were actually saying that they disagreed with the whole post-bellum lost cause mythology, which was really where this whole myth that the South secession was just about states' rights and not about slavery originated. John Mosby, for one, said on more than one occasion that he thought it was humbug. He said, no, we weren't fighting just for states' rights. We were fighting for slavery. Again, consult one of the sources that I shared beneath this video if you want to see the proof of that. So, folks, please, as this controversy wears on, as hopefully more and more jurisdictions across the United States get rid of these disgraceful tributes to an explicitly and indisputably white supremacist, slavery perpetuating regime before you run around spouting these absurd claims and absurd arguments about how removing these tributes to that white supremacist slave-holding regime somehow erases history. Stop and think. Think about the main sources of historical knowledge. Think about the last time you learned more from some damn statue or flag or plaque about history than you would have learned from your school teachers or your textbooks or a visit to a museum. If people want to display these tributes to the Confederacy on their private property, that's their business. It's totally protected by the First Amendment, as well it should be. But on public property, on taxpayer-funded property, property that is financed by black folks' tax dollars as well as everyone else's, these monuments have no rightful place. And that brings me to another point I wanted to make very quickly. All this talk about Southern heritage and how the Confederate flag and monuments to Confederate generals supposedly just honor history and heritage, they miss a very important point. White Southerners' heritage is not the only heritage that's at play here. I think there are ways people can find to honor Southern heritage without glorifying the South's ugly racist past. I support those commemorations, those tributes to Southern culture and heritage. But certain symbols of the South, like the Confederate flag or battle flag as it were, or monuments to Confederate generals, or anything really that honors the Confederacy in particular, no, I'm sorry. There's no way you can extricate the Confederacy from the legacy of slavery and white supremacy. The two are inextricably linked because one was explicitly based on the other. Let's not forget, African Americans have a heritage as well. And that heritage is completely disrespected, to say the very least, to put it very mildly and charitably, by the erection of these kinds of commemorations on public, taxpayer-funded government property. It sends a message that what the Confederacy stood for was somehow acceptable, or at least forgivable, even though, in fact, it stood for a cause that is fundamentally and indisputably at odds with the interests and the dignity and the honor of Black America. So before you go making that argument, falling back on that same lame excuse for this Confederate paraphernalia and memorabilia celebrating Southern heritage, stop and think. Remember, that's not the only heritage that's pertinent to this issue.